Andy Griffith is a name whose mere mention for most everyone above a certain age immediately kindles memories of a TV show set in an idyllic place and time. Mayberry in the 60s, based loosely on the North Carolina town Mount Airy, where Andy Griffith was born and raised, is home to some quirky characters and simple folks. That's Mayberry, by the way, not Mount Airy. I realize I could get myself in trouble mighty fast if I'm not clear on that. The older you get, and the more fractured and loud the world becomes, the more it seems like a good place to visit if you could. Now, I don't know that I'd want to live there, but it'd be nice to visit now and then. One episode of the Andy Griffith Show that seems appropriate for me to reflect on is the one titled The Sermon for Today. In it, a guest preacher from New York visits Mayberry and delivers a message entitled, "What's Your Hurry?" Dr. Harrison Everett Breen speaks to the congregation about the pitfalls of rushing here and there as we tend to do in modern times. Why this senseless rush, this mad pursuit, this frantic competition, this pace that kills, the esteemed Dr. Breen says to the good folks of Mayberry. Why do we drive ourselves as we do? In our furious race these days to conquer outer space, are we not perhaps forgetting inner space? Shall we find the true meaning of life by fleeing from it, he says. The irony, of course, is that Dr. Breen is preaching these words to the residents of Mayberry, which is about as relaxed a place as you'd ever hope to find. In fact, during the sermon, Gomer and Barney both fight off sleep because they're so relaxed. As a quick aside, one of my favorite scenes in that show in that particular episode is when the congregation is heading out of the worship service and shaking hands with the guest preacher. Barney, intent on trying to impress the visitor whose sermon on resting he slept through mostly, says to him, "Yes, sir, that's one subject you just can't talk enough about, sin." He never said a word about sin. That afternoon, following a big lunch cooked by Aunt Bee, Andy and Barney sit on the front porch, leaning back in their chairs, talking in a most relaxed way about how much they've eaten and dreaming about maybe driving over to the drugstore for some ice cream later. You could hardly call these folks in a hurry. That is until Aunt Bee comes outside and Gomer walks up and they all start reminiscing about the days when they used to have Sunday evening band concerts. And as they talk about it more and more, they get all excited and they decide that such a concert was the very thing they needed to have. And so they decide that Andy will round up the band members and practice, Barney and Gomer will repair the bandstand, and Aunt Bee and her good friend Clara will sew up and repair the old band uniforms. Everybody jumps off the porch, ready for action. Now, if you remember this episode, what starts out as a promising idea quickly turns into disaster. The band members, long out of practice, are just awful. One of them is almost deaf. Aunt Bee and Clara get upset with one another as they struggle to repair the moldy uniforms. And Barney and Gomer fuss at one another and eventually knock the whole bandstand over when Gomer evidently swings a hammer at a spider. Those of you who are too young to remember this show are probably happy you don't. But I enjoyed it. The final scene takes place back on Andy's front porch where Andy and his family and friends are all sitting there exhausted. Up walks the New York preacher strolling by and he compliments them on honoring his sermon about relaxing. Well, of course, just the opposite is true because they've completely failed to heed his advice. Now, I'd say the Mayberry folks' error wasn't so much in working toward a band concert. I don't see anything wrong with that plan. The problem was their attempt to do it suddenly that day. They rushed themselves when they could have relaxed that Sunday afternoon. Relax is what Jesus tells his disciples to do in today's gospel lesson from Mark chapter 6. The apostles have gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they have done and taught during a missionary trip, which is what we heard in the scriptures today. As noted earlier in the chapter, Jesus had sent the 12 out 2 by 2 into the villages of Galilee where they were preaching the need for repentance and they were healing the sick. Now they've returned from this big missionary trip and they're all excited to share with Jesus all these details of what took place. But so many other people are crowding around Jesus and the disciples that they can't even sit down to eat. So Jesus tells his closest followers, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Rest a while. It's a message we probably do need to hear today, just as the visiting preacher from New York felt that the people of Mayberry needed to hear it. What's your hurry is a question we might ask ourselves, as Dr. Breen asked in his sermon. Ironically, before the 8:30 service, Scott Lawing saw me racing to get to the service, and he says, "You're late." So reality, we all need to hear this. In fact, I would say and confess that I especially need to hear it. And I've got a two-sided mirror because I suspect that you may need to hear this message as well. Some here might be like the workaholic whose sign over his desk read, "Thank God for Mondays." Now, if that's sounding a little odd, I submit for some, it's already Monday today. And by that I mean that we may not be fully celebrating the Sabbath because our minds are already back at work this morning. We've never left work, even though we might be sitting here in church. Warren Wiersbe, former pastor of Moody Church in Chicago, is quoted as saying, "The ability to calm your soul and wait before God is one of the most difficult things in the Christian life. Our old nature is restless. The world around us is frantically in a hurry. But a restless heart usually leads to a reckless life." It's one of the amazing things about Jesus. He led, by all accounts, a very busy life. I mean, he was teaching and he was healing and he was ministering to those in need. His life was filled with activity, and yet he never seemed to be in a hurry. He never seemed to be in a hurry. He never seemed frantic about anything, even when he got word that his friend Lazarus was ill. Jesus just never appeared to be in a rush under any circumstances. Yet, has anyone ever accomplished more in his life than Christ? Darren Kahn tells the story about two woodsmen. One day, one of them challenged the other to an all-day tree chopping contest. I guess that's something woodsmen do, supposedly. The challenger worked very hard, stopping only for lunch and a quick break that day. The other one, however, didn't appear to be as hot and bothered. He had a leisurely lunch, he took several other breaks as well, and at the end of the day, the challenger was exhausted and annoyed that the other woodsman had chopped considerably more wood than he had. "I don't get it," he said. "Every time I checked, you're taking a rest, yet you chopped more wood than I did." "But you didn't notice," said the winning woodsman, "that I was sharpening my axe when I sat down to rest." You and I need to be sharpening our axe too, so as to remain keen, and the only time you can sharpen your axe is when you're not chopping wood with it. In other words, you can't rest and work at the same time. Rest is not an option. It's just as important to survival as food, water, and air, says Kahn. Jesus clearly understood the importance of taking time out to rejuvenate the body, mind, and spirit, such as when he told the disciples to come away to a secluded space and rest a while. Jesus knew how critical it was to stop and rest, not only for other people, but for himself as well. You can't keep pushing yourself indefinitely without negative consequences. The human body and mind are designed by God in such a way as to need regular rest. There's a Greek legend that in ancient Athens, a man noticed Aesop, the great storyteller, playing childish games with some little boys. The man laughed at and jeered Aesop and asked him why he was wasting his time with such frivolous activity. Aesop responded by picking up a bow, loosening its string, and placing it on the ground before the critical man. And then he said to him, "Now answer the riddle if you can. Tell us what the unstrung bow implies." The man stared at it for a while and finally could not figure out what the point Aesop was trying to make. Finally, Aesop explained, if you keep the bow always bent, it will eventually break. But if you let it go slack, it will be more fit for use when you need it. What's true for a bow is equally true for us. If we're always strung tightly, then we'll eventually break. But if we slacken a bit now and then, we'll find that we're much more fit for use when needed. Jesus could see that his disciples and he needed some time away from the crowd, some R&R. His example should not be lost on us. None of this should come as a surprise when we consider the creation account in the first and second chapters of Genesis. God is said to have rested on the seventh day after creating the heavens and the earth. In his classic book titled The Sabbath, Jewish scholar and theologian Abraham Heschel emphasizes this by writing, "Just as heaven and earth were created in 6 days, Menuha, which is Hebrew for rest, was created on the seventh, or the Sabbath." Now, this is interesting because rest here is not a negative concept, he notes, but something positive to make the universe complete. Now think about that. It's rather than seeing the Sabbath as the absence of work, he sees it as part of the creative process by God. It's a creative act of God, the Sabbath. And so Heschel asks, what was created on the Sabbath? Tranquility, serenity, peace, and repose. During their exodus from Egypt, the Israelites received the 10 Commandments, including the command, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. The Sabbath was to be a sign of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. God ordained that there be a balance between work and rest, and thus we should understand the Sabbath as a great gift from God, for it reveals God's concern for us and our well-being. As Jesus reminded the Pharisees who criticized his disciples for picking grain on the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The idea of Sabbath is to provide human beings with restoration through periodic rest. In other words, it's for our own good. So the question is, are we taking full advantage of the opportunity for Sabbath rest, or do we instead allow our daily concerns of work and other responsibilities so control our thoughts that we never get away from them? Asked another way, what happens when we fail really to keep the Sabbath, by which I mean not allowing ourselves fully to rest by releasing our daily concerns of the remainder of the week and letting God, for one special day each week, sustain us and revive us? What happens then? Well, one thing is that we negate the benefits that otherwise would accrue to us in worship. If in this hour we're so wrapped up in our thoughts about what we have to do tomorrow or what at home later today, then we've missed out on what otherwise could be a recharging of our spiritual as well as physical and mental batteries. The same is true with regard to the remainder of the Sabbath. Now, I recognize, of course, that sometimes there are extenuating circumstances necessitating work on Sundays, and some of our jobs, such as worship leaders and medical professionals, require it. But if we fail to take at least one day or some period of a day at least from the regular grind, we'll eventually wear ourselves out. And I don't care who you are, over time, you will wear out if you never take a break. You'll become edgy and even incompetent. No one can sustain peak performance forever without rest, not even a top athlete. I was going to pick up the mirror there, but I'm afraid you'd think I was thinking of myself as an example of a top athlete, and that would be distracting to say the least. Here's one more important thing about Sabbath observance, and it's something I don't know that we've always thought about. Keeping the Sabbath not only revives us through rest, but it also builds us up in spirit by causing us to connect better with God. Observing the Sabbath means that we're aligning with God's rhythm of life, that we're ordering our lives around God's schedule, that we're giving God a definite and permanent place in our lives. When we remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, set apart, in other words, as God has commanded us to do, then we are honoring God and saying, God, you are so important to me that one day each week I'll make a special effort to set aside all my other concerns and focus on you. In doing so, I know that I'll be drawn closer to you and therefore will be blessed by you. Jesus invited his disciples to join him for some rest and renewal. And Jesus invites us to do the same every week. It's not something to overlook, as it's very important to our spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. I began this message by remembering one sitcom from the 60s. Another one will help us close it out. At the end of every episode of the Beverly Hillbillies, a tune written by Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs from right down the road in Shelby, North Carolina, would be sung, which included the lines, "Set a spell, take your shoes off." And so I invite you to do the same. Take your shoes off. That is when you get home, please, not right now. and set a spell today. Take a break from it all and allow God to heal you through that rest and to make you whole. Sabbath is a gift from God, and I encourage you to accept it if you want to live a healthier, happier, longer, and more meaningful life. Amen.